Chapter 1. The Body in the Consulting Room. There are moments in life so profoundly strange that the mind refuses at first to accept their full weight. I have accompanied Sherlock Holmes through enough peculiar hours to believe myself largely immune to astonishment. Yet the evening of the 14th of November, in the year 1897, shook even my well-seasoned nerves to their foundation. For it was on that fog-drenched Tuesday, as the gas lamps of Baker Street burned with an orange drowsiness behind the window glass, that I arrived at 221B to find my dear friend in chains, and a dead man cooling in Holmes's own armchair. I had spent the afternoon at my practice in Kensington, attending to a minor but persistent cough that had afflicted 3 members of the Fortescue family in succession. The work was unremarkable, the patients grateful, and my mind had drifted pleasantly toward the prospect of a quiet evening with Holmes, perhaps some chess, perhaps a back air on the violin, and the not inconsiderable comfort of Mrs. Hudson's roast pheasant, which I had been given to understand was on the evening's menu. The fog was already thickening considerably as I hailed a cab on the Cromwell Road, and by the time we turned into Baker Street, it had descended with that peculiarly London determination that transforms familiar thoroughfares into something half mythological. The first sign that something was wrong was the quantity of light blazing from the first-floor windows. Every gas jet in the sitting room appeared to be burning at full height, spilling amber rectangles onto the pavement below. The second sign was Inspector Lestrade, standing on the front step with his hat gripped in both hands and an expression on his face I had not seen since the affair of the Andover poisonings, a kind of helpless, institutional bewilderment, as though the machinery of Scotland Yard had been asked to process a fact for which it possessed no category. Dr. Watson. He seized my arm the moment I descended from the cab, drawing me away from the door with an urgency that alarmed me considerably. "I am very glad you've come, very glad indeed. This is, I confess, Doctor, I do not quite know where to begin." "Then begin at the beginning," I said, with a calmness I did not entirely feel. "What has happened? Is Holmes unwell?" "Unwell?" Lestrade almost laughed at the word, but it came out wrong. A short strangled sound devoid of humour. "That is one way of putting it. Mr. Holmes is... He is currently in the care of Constable Abernethy upstairs. He has been restrained, Doctor, for his own safety and for the preservation of evidence." I stared at the inspector. "Restrained? You mean Holmes is under arrest?" "Not precisely arrested. Not yet. That is..." Lestrade passed a hand over his face. "There is a dead man in his armchair, Doctor. Sir Edmund Calvert, the industrialist. You may have read of him in the papers. The Calvert Iron Works, the man who refused to sell his Northumbrian properties to the Crown last spring. He has been found dead in Mr. Holmes's consulting room, with what preliminary examination suggests is a very lethal dose of potassium cyanide administered in his tea. The teacup is on the side table. There are no signs of forced entry. And Mr. Holmes..." Another pause, almost theatrical in its reluctance, "was found by Mrs. Hudson alone in the room with the body when she came to collect the tea service." The street seemed to tilt slightly beneath my feet. "That is absurd," I said. "I am inclined to agree with you," said Lestrade quietly. "But agreement, Doctor, is not the same as evidence, and evidence is what I am obliged to follow. Will you come up?" The staircase of 221B has never felt so long as it did that night. Every familiar detail, the slightly worn patch on the third step, the faint smell of tobacco and chemical reagents that permanently inhabits the upper hallway, the distant clatter of Mrs. Hudson's kitchen, all of it felt strange and tilted, as though I were moving through a careful reproduction of a place I loved, built by someone who had studied it closely but misunderstood its essential character. Holmes sat in the straight-back chair near the fireplace, not his habitual armchair, that was occupied, horribly, by a large and distinguished-looking man of perhaps 60, whose grey head lolled at an angle that no living person would choose, and whose face wore the slack, almost offended expression of the newly and violently dead. Constable Abernethy stood beside Holmes with the wooden discomfort of a young man doing something he privately considers senseless, for Holmes wore no handcuffs. The restraint Lestrade had mentioned appeared to consist primarily of Abernethy's presence, and what I suspected was Holmes's own decision not to move. My friend looked up when I entered, and I saw in his grey eyes something I had rarely observed there. Not distress, precisely, but a quality of compressed and furious attention, as though every one of his remarkable faculties had been simultaneously wound to the maximum possible tension. He was pale. His long fingers, resting on his knees, were entirely still, which in Holmes is always more alarming than agitation. "Watson," he said in his usual voice, "I am exceedingly glad you're here. Sit down if you can find a chair that is not occupied by a corpse or a constable. We have, I think, approximately 3 days before someone I am not at liberty to name will attempt to leave the country, and I find that Inspector Lestrade's presence has introduced certain logistical complications into my evening. Holmes? I crossed to him and examined him with a physician's eye. No visible injury, no evidence of struggle on his person, though I noted a slight reddening of the right wrist that might suggest something had briefly been applied there. Can you tell me what happened? The thin, hawk-like face remained composed. I can tell you everything that happened, he said. The difficulty, Watson, is that what happened and what this room appears to demonstrate are two entirely different things, and I am currently in the remarkable position of being the only person on earth who knows the full truth, apart from the murderer, of course, who is counting rather heavily on my being unable to prove it. Lestrade cleared his throat from the doorway. Perhaps, Mr. Holmes, you might favour us with an account of how Sir Edmund Calvert came to be dead in your armchair. Holmes regarded the inspector with an expression of patient, almost affectionate contempt. By all means, Lestrade. Pull up a chair. This will take some time, and some of it may surprise even you. He paused, his fingers momentarily tightening on his knees, the only visible concession to the gravity of his situation. But first, Watson, would you be so good as to examine the body? Not because I require your findings to know what killed the man, but because I should like your independent medical opinion on record before this room is further disturbed. Specifically, I would direct your attention to his left cufflink, the mud on his right shoe, and the inner pocket of his jacket. I moved toward the armchair with the quiet professionalism that years of medicine and, I confess, years of Holmes's company had instilled. Sir Edmund Calvert had been, in life, a man of considerable physical presence, broad-shouldered, well-fed, with the confident bearing of a self-made magnate who has spent 40 years being the largest personality in every room he entered. In death, he seemed somehow diminished, not in size but in authority, as though the animating force that had made him formidable had simply departed, leaving the physical machinery behind. I examined him carefully, noting the bluish tinge around the lips and the faint smell that confirmed Lestrade's preliminary assessment. Cyanide poisoning, swift and almost certainly fatal within minutes of ingestion. I noted the left cufflink, plain silver but improperly fastened, as though replaced in haste by someone unfamiliar with its mechanism. I noted the mud on the right shoe, a distinctive clay-like reddish substance utterly inconsistent with the wet London pavements outside. And then I reached into the inner pocket of his jacket. What I found there made me straighten slowly and look at Holmes with an entirely new understanding of the magnitude of what we faced. For in that pocket, folded once, was a small card of thick cream vellum, bearing a single line of handwriting in a bold, angular script that I would have recognised anywhere, having watched it produce hundreds of notes, telegrams, and chemical annotations over the years of our friendship. It read, "Come at 7. I have what you require." S.H. Holmes watched my face as I read it. "Yes," he said quietly. "I thought you would find that interesting. I wrote no such note, Watson. I have never in my life addressed Sir Edmund Calvert, and that," his grey eyes moved to Lestrade with an expression of absolute clarity, "is where this story properly begins." Chapter 2, on the curious matter of the uninvited guest. There is a species of problem that even Sherlock Holmes, who thrives on complexity as ordinary men thrive on bread and fresh air, regards with a certain wary respect. It is not the problem that is merely difficult, or merely obscure, or merely dangerous. It is the problem that has been deliberately constructed to be insoluble, the problem designed by someone who has studied the mind of the investigator and built the trap specifically around its shape. As Holmes explained the events of that afternoon to Lestrade and myself, I understood with a creeping cold certainty that we were in the presence of precisely such a problem. The afternoon had begun unremarkably. Holmes had been occupied, he said, with a monograph he was composing on the mineralogical properties of 37 varieties of pipe ash, a subject in which he had been immersed for the better part of 2 weeks, to the general detriment of our sitting-room surfaces. Mrs. Hudson had brought tea at 4:30. Holmes had drunk his, eaten one of her excellent biscuits, and returned to his writing. At 5:15, she'd come again to collect the service, found him absorbed, and retreated without disturbing him. At 6:20, she'd come to ask whether Holmes would be joining me for dinner, received no reply from behind the closed study door, and assumed he was napping, a habit she had long since ceased to find remarkable. At 7:00 precisely, and here Holmes's account became for the first time something that was not entirely his own reconstruction, Mrs. Hudson had heard the front bell, admitted a large gentleman she described as most distinguished-looking, very well-dressed, and something impatient in his manner, who had announced himself as having an appointment with Mr. Holmes. She had shown him upstairs to the sitting-room, offered him tea, which he had accepted, and gone below to inform Holmes of his visitor's arrival. She found the study door ajar, Holmes said. I was not within. She assumed I had already gone through to the sitting-room by the inner passage, a reasonable supposition. What actually occurred, I can only reconstruct from evidence, as I was at that time elsewhere. Elsewhere, Lestrade repeated, with the particular inflection of a man who finds this word inadequate to the occasion. In the back lane behind Baker Street, said Holmes, with the calm of someone discussing the weather. I had received a note at approximately 5:30, delivered by a small boy, as is the custom when someone wishes to avoid the record of the telegraph office, purporting to be from Mycroft, requesting that I come immediately to a certain address in Paddington. The note was a forgery, as I have since established, but a very competent one. My brother's handwriting has certain idiosyncrasies that are difficult to replicate, and whoever produced this note had clearly studied a genuine sample with considerable care. I went. I found nothing at the Paddington address but an empty room and a landlady who had never heard of Mycroft Holmes. I returned. I came upstairs. I found Calvert dead in my chair, and Mrs. Hudson in a state of considerable agitation on the landing. The silence that followed this account was of the dense, thoughtful variety. Lestrade stood with his notebook open and his pencil hovering, giving the impression of a man who is writing down words he does not entirely believe. So your account is, he said carefully, that someone, you don't know who, lured you away from Baker Street with a forged note, simultaneously arranged for Sir Edmund Calvert to call here at 7, poisoned him during your absence, left a forged invitation card in his pocket purporting to be from you, and departed without trace. That is the skeleton of it, Holmes agreed. The flesh, the motive, the method of the poison's administration, the identity of the architect. That, Lestrade, is what we must now determine. You will forgive me, Mr. Holmes, if I observe that this account is extraordinarily convenient. I would forgive you more readily, Holmes replied, if your observation were interesting. Of course it is convenient. It is intended to appear convenient. That is the point. He rose from the chair, Abernethy started, then subsided, and moved toward the window, peering down at the fog-shrouded street below with the concentrated attention of a man reading a text. However, convenience is not the same as falsehood, and I draw your attention to several inconvenient details that your theory of my guilt must somehow accommodate. He turned from the window and held up one long, thin finger. First, if I had killed Calvert, why would I remain in this room with the body? I am not, as a general rule, an impulsive man. A premeditated murder discovered by the murderer who then sits calmly in his own consulting room, awaiting detection, is not the act of the same intelligence that has previously outwitted every criminal mind of the age. A second finger. Second, the forged note in Calvert's pocket. It is addressed in my hand, yes, a very fine imitation of my hand, but examine it, Lestrade. The word require is spelled in the American fashion, with an E before the I. I am Oxford educated. I do not make that error. Whoever wrote that note has seen my handwriting, but has not studied my correspondence with sufficient care to observe my spelling conventions. A third finger. Third, the teacup. There are 2 teacups on the side table. Mrs. Hudson brought one for Calvert, the china from the guest service, with the blue rim. The second cup, the plain white one, which is from my habitual set, contains, if you will be good enough to smell it, Inspector, traces of something rather more interesting than Darjeeling. Lestrade crossed to the side table with the reluctant, slightly affronted air of a man who suspects he's about to be shown something he ought to have noticed himself. He bent over the plain white cup and straightened almost immediately, his expression sharpening. Chloral hydrate, or something very similar in its olfactory profile, Holmes said. Someone was in this room today before Calvert arrived. Someone who drank from my cup, or more accurately, filled my cup, added a sedative, and left it ready in anticipation of my early return. They did not know I would be out until 7. They had prepared for the contingency of my returning before they were finished. I looked at the white cup with a cold feeling that had nothing to do with the November draught under the window. Someone had been in this room. Someone had prepared a drugged cup for Holmes specifically as a contingency plan. This had been arranged with a precision and a forethought that went far beyond the improvised act of a desperate criminal. This had been planned at leisure. Who knew that Calvert was coming here, I asked. Nobody, Holmes said, because Calvert was not coming here. He had no appointment with me. He was brought here, By the same forged note, I imagine, that brought me to Paddington. A man of his prominence would not ordinarily visit Baker Street on a whim. Someone gave him a reason, someone who knew that I would be absent and that the sitting room would therefore be unoccupied and available for the staging of a scene. "But why?" Lestrade said. "Why go to all this trouble to implicate you? What does anyone gain by seeing you charged with murder?" Holmes was quiet for a moment. In the firelight, his face was very still and very sharp, like a fine engraving of itself. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows with a soft, insistent patience. When he spoke, his voice had lost none of its composure, but it had gained something else, something that, in a less extraordinary man, I might have called unease. "That," he said softly, "is a question I have been considering since I came upstairs and found a dead baronet in my armchair. And the answer, Watson, the answer is the most alarming thing about this entire affair, because the only people who would benefit from my incarceration are people who are afraid of what I am about to discover. Which means that somewhere, in a case I'm currently engaged upon, or in information I currently possess without yet understanding its significance, there is a truth so dangerous to someone that they are willing to commit murder to prevent me from reaching it." He turned back to the window. Below, a cab rattled through the fog and was gone. "And that means," Holmes continued very quietly, "that I am looking in exactly the right direction. I simply do not yet know what I am looking at." Chapter 3. Lestrade's Burden and the Morning Papers. By 10 o'clock that evening, a compromise of sorts had been achieved between the demands of Scotland Yard and the rather more pressing demands of logical necessity. Lestrade, who was a more flexible man than his institutional position sometimes permits him to appear, accepted Holmes's account as a working hypothesis, not, he was at pains to emphasize, as established fact, and not as a permanent stay of any official action that the evidence might eventually compel him to take. But he accepted it sufficiently to release Holmes into what he called his own recognizance, and what Holmes called, with faint contempt, the freedom to work. The body of Sir Edmund Calvert was removed to the morgue. The teacups were taken into evidence. A constable was posted discreetly at the far end of Baker Street, in the manner that Lestrade clearly imagined was not visible from our windows, and that Holmes identified as Abernethy within 30 seconds of his departure. Mrs. Hudson, who possesses a remarkable self-possession, for a woman who has found a peer of the realm dead in her first-floor sitting-room, brought us a late supper of cold pheasant and bread that neither of us ate with any enthusiasm. Holmes paced. I watched him pace, which is the particular and somewhat wearing role that friendship with Holmes assigns one during the early stages of a case. Witness, audience, and occasional sounding board, performing the function of a thinking presence against which he can test and discard hypotheses before they calcify into convictions. "Tell me about Sir Edmund Calvert," I said at last, when the pacing had continued long enough that I felt justified in interrupting it. Holmes paused, pivoted, and settled abruptly into his chair. The other chair, not the one still carrying the psychological residue of Calvert's death. "What do you know of him already?" "What the papers report. The iron works, the land dispute with the Crown last spring. Some political manoeuvring during the recent elections. I believe he had connections to certain members of Parliament who were opposed to the new industrial labour legislation." "He was 58 years old," Holmes said, his eyes moving to the ceiling in the manner that indicates he is reading from some internal catalogue. "He was born in Durham to a family of modest means and built the Calvert Iron Works from a single foundry. His father left him into an enterprise employing 4,000 men across Northumbria and Yorkshire. He was ruthless, capable, and, in certain circles, very much feared. He had been married twice. His first wife died in 1873 of typhoid. His second wife, the present Lady Calvert, née Dorothea Marsh, is considerably younger, a woman of good family and apparently excellent temper, who has produced 2 children and managed her husband's domestic affairs with commendable efficiency, while he managed his business ones with what I understand was rather less commendable ethics." "You had investigated him before?" "No, but his name appeared in a context that interested me, approximately 3 weeks ago. You recall the matter of the missing trade documents from the Board of Trade Offices?" I recalled it vaguely. A brief mention in the papers of certain industrial licensing papers that had disappeared from a government filing room, their absence only discovered when a clerk went to retrieve them for a routine inspection. The story had seemed minor at the time, a bureaucratic misadventure rather than a crime, and it had vanished from the columns almost immediately. "Calvert's name appeared in connection with those documents," Holmes said. "Specifically, several of the missing papers related to licensing disputes involving the Northumbrian iron rights, territories that Calvert controlled, or wish to control. I had been looking into the matter at Mycroft's indirect request, though I had not yet reached any conclusions worth reporting. And now Sir Edmund Calvert is dead in my armchair, and the person who arranged his death has gone to considerable trouble to ensure that I, the one investigator who was already looking into the matter, am either imprisoned or sufficiently discredited to be neutralised. I sat with this for a moment. Outside, the fog had thickened further, and Baker Street was as silent as it ever became, which was not very silent. But tonight possessed a particular quality of muffled tension, as though the city itself were listening. Then the missing documents and the murder are connected, I said. Almost certainly. The question is the direction of the connection. Were the documents stolen to prevent Calvert from obtaining them, or were they stolen by Calvert and someone killed him to prevent him from using them? Or, Holmes's fingers steepled together under his chin, were they stolen by a third party entirely, and is Calvert's death intended to prevent anyone from noticing that the document's disappearance and his various business dealings form a pattern that would be deeply embarrassing to someone quite other than Calvert himself? The morning brought the newspapers, and the newspapers brought what I had rather feared they would bring. The story had leaked, as London stories invariably do, propelled by the irresistible pressure of the city's appetite for sensation, and it had been processed by the press with the efficiency and the accuracy that one might charitably describe as selective. The more temperate journals contented themselves with a factual account. Sir Edmund Calvert found dead at consulting rooms of Mr. Sherlock Holmes. Police investigation ongoing. The less temperate ones had taken certain liberties with implication that stopped considerably short of accusation only because their solicitors were evidently cautious men. Holmes read them all, from the Times to the most lurid of the evening papers, with the detached attention of a scientist examining cultures in a dish. He made no comment on any of them until he reached a small notice in the personal column of the Daily Chronicle, at which point he sat forward with a sharpness that made me look up from my own reading. Watson. This. He passed the paper across. The notice was brief. DM. The matter progresses as arranged. Keep your counsel. The next communication will come through the usual channel. Patience is a virtue in all negotiations. A friend. DM, I said. Dorothea Marsh, Lady Calvert. Her maiden initials, yes. Whoever placed this notice was confident she would see it and recognise its significance, but not confident enough to use her married name, perhaps because the married name given yesterday's events might attract attention. Holmes was on his feet, reaching for his jacket. It was placed yesterday evening. Watson, after Calvert's death, was known to the police, but before it was publicly reported, which means our letter writer knew of the death before the morning papers, and knew that Lady Calvert would need either reassurance or instructions. You think she's involved? I think she's connected. Connected and, if this notice is any indication, being managed. There is a meaningful difference between the architect and the instrument of a scheme of this complexity. He paused at the door. I intend to call upon Lady Calvert this morning. I would recommend you accompany me, as your presence tends to render me slightly less alarming to bereaved women of good family. Also, bring your revolver. This last instruction, delivered in the same tone as the social observation preceding it, struck me as the morning's most revealing remark. Holmes asks me to carry a weapon only when he expects, at some level, that we may require it. Whatever he had concluded in the small hours, and I had heard him moving about the sitting-room until at least 3, it had persuaded him that this case carried a physical as well as an intellectual danger. I retrieved my revolver from the desk drawer and checked its chambers, while Holmes ordered a cab. The fog was already beginning to lift, revealing a cold, bright November morning, the kind of day that looks deceptively safe and ordinary from a window, and proves rather otherwise when one ventures out into it. Chapter 4. Lady Calvert and the Architecture of Grief. The Calvert townhouse in Eaton Square was a substantial and handsomely appointed building of the kind that says, in every stone and every window dressing, that its occupant has arrived at wealth by routes that require no apology. The black crape already hung above the door. Someone had moved with considerable efficiency in the matter of public mourning, and the footman who admitted us wore the subdued expression of household staff who have been issued their emotional instructions along with their morning duties. We were kept in the entrance hall for some minutes, during which Holmes examined the umbrella stand with the focused interest he brings to all surfaces that other people use without noticing, and I studied a portrait above the fireplace of a broad, confident man in late middle age, whom I took to be Sir Edmund in his prime. Lady Calvert received us in the first-floor drawing-room. She was a handsome woman of perhaps 38, fine-featured and self-possessed in the manner of someone who has cultivated composure as a practical tool rather than a social grace. Her morning dress was already in place. Again, that slightly unnerving efficiency, and she wore her grief, I thought, with the careful arrangement of someone who is experiencing something real, but who has decided precisely how much of it to show. She rose when we entered and offered her hand to us both, with a steadiness that was either admirable or remarkable, depending on one's prior assumptions about the female character under strain. "Mr. Holmes," she said, "I confess I was uncertain whether to receive you, under the circumstances." "Your uncertainty is entirely understandable," Holmes replied, with a courtesy that he does not always trouble himself to deploy, but which, when he chooses to employ it, has a quality of focused attention that women of intelligence tend to find disarming. "And I am grateful for your decision to do so. I wish to offer my condolences, Lady Calvert, and, if you will permit me, to ask a small number of questions that may materially assist in establishing what happened to your husband." "The police have been here already," she said, settling back into her chair with a composure that flickered only very slightly at the edges. "Inspector Lestrade early this morning. He was very thorough." "I'm sure he was. My questions are somewhat different from Lestrade's." Holmes crossed his legs and regarded her with the steady, benevolent attention that looks like social ease, and is in fact a form of extremely precise observation. "To begin with a simple matter. Did your husband tell you he was intending to call upon me last evening?" A pause, brief, but real. "He did not. Edmund rarely discussed his professional movements in detail. Did he mention my name at all in the past several weeks?" Another pause, longer. Lady Calvert looked at the window, which gave onto the pale, cleared sky of the morning. "Once," she said, "approximately a fortnight ago. He came home in some agitation from a meeting. I did not know at the time whom he had met, and he said that he had been told certain information might be in the possession of Mr. Sherlock Holmes, and that this was a complication he did not welcome." Holmes showed no particular reaction to this, though I observed the slight tension in his right hand that indicates something has struck him as significant. "He did not elaborate on what information?" "No, Edmund was not an elaborating man, Mr. Holmes. He held his counsel in most things." She paused again, then added with a precision that suggested she had rehearsed the decision to include it. "He was frightened, though. I had not seen Edmund frightened in 30 years of knowing him. Whatever the information was, it alarmed him considerably." "Lady Calvert," Holmes said, very quietly, "I am going to ask you something that you may find intrusive, and I apologize in advance for the intrusion. But I believe it is essential. Did your husband have enemies? Not the ordinary enemies of commerce and competition, but enemies who might consider violence a tool of business." Something passed across her face. Too fast to classify, too real to be entirely performance. "He was a powerful man," she said. "Powerful men have people who wish them ill." "That is diplomatically expressed," Holmes said. "May I be rather less diplomatic? The name Aldous Fenwick. Does it mean anything to you?" The reaction this time was unmistakable and uncontrolled. A sharp inhalation, a whitening around the eyes, a tightening of the hands in the dark fabric of her skirt. She recovered within seconds, but the seconds were enough. Holmes's expression did not change, but I knew he had seen what I had seen. "I know the name," she said carefully. "In what connection?" "He was a former business associate of my husband's, many years ago. Before the ironworks became what they are. There was some dispute. A settlement was reached. I know very little of the details." Each sentence came out measured and slightly separate, like bricks being laid with deliberate care. "The dispute involved the original Northumbrian mining rights," Holmes said. It was not a question. "Fenwick's claim that the foundry's foundational contracts were obtained through documents that had been altered." Lady Calvert said nothing, which is itself, in a conversation with Holmes, a species of answer. "The settlement," Holmes continued, "was substantial enough to remove Fenwick from the public record, but apparently not from your husband's memory, nor, I suspect, from his own." He rose from his chair, moving to the window with that peculiar quality of motion that makes his presence in a room feel both larger and less fixed than it ought to. "One final question, and then I will disturb you no further this morning. The personal column of yesterday's Daily Chronicle. Did you see it?" The whitening returned, more sustained now. "I did not read the papers yesterday." "But you were expecting a communication of some kind, from someone you knew as a friend." Lady Calvert looked at him for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice had changed. The careful architecture of it had partially given way, revealing something underneath that was less composed and considerably more frightened. "Mr. Holmes," she said, "I am going to tell you something. Not because I am required to, and not because I believe it will help you, I believe, frankly, it may do the opposite. But because I find that I cannot sit in this room with a man of your capabilities and pretend to a degree of innocence that I do not entirely possess." She drew a breath. I knew my husband's business affairs were not entirely clean. I knew there were matters in his past that had been managed. I was aware that there was a person, I did not know who, I was never told who had assisted my husband in a significant legal difficulty some years ago, in exchange for an ongoing arrangement that I was not made party to. In the past 6 months, that arrangement had apparently been renegotiated, on terms Edmund found unacceptable. I did not know what was being demanded of him, but he was frightened. And frightened men sometimes go to consult the one person in London who is most capable of getting them out of impossible situations. "They come to me," Holmes said softly. "Yes," said Lady Calvert, "they come to you." She met his eyes directly. "I do not believe you killed my husband, Mr. Holmes. I believe someone made very sure that it would appear that you had. In the cab going back to Baker Street, I sat in silence for several minutes, organising what I'd heard into something my mind could comfortably process. Holmes sat opposite me with his eyes half closed and his fingers working in the faint, rapid pattern that means he is thinking at a speed that he considers it unnecessary to share with anyone else at present. "Aldous Fenwick," I said at last. "Who is he?" "A man," said Holmes, "who's been very careful, for a very long time, not to be anyone at all." His eyes opened fully, and they had the quality I associate with the moment when a significant piece falls into its correct position, which is, in itself, a kind of answer. Chapter 5. The Ghost Who Left Footprints. The name Aldous Fenwick, as Holmes had suggested, appeared to belong to a man who had exercised considerable talent for disappearing from official records. A morning spent at the newspaper archive and an afternoon in correspondence with Mycroft, who replied, as always, with a brevity that contained more information than most men could generate in a volume, began to assemble a portrait of a person who was simultaneously more interesting and more dangerous than the cautious blankness of his public existence suggested. Fenwick had begun, as best Holmes could reconstruct, as a solicitor's clerk in Newcastle in the mid-1860s. He had progressed, through what appeared to be a combination of genuine legal intelligence and a facility for being present at moments of contractual importance to other, more powerful people, to a position of quiet but substantial influence in the northern industrial world. He had never founded a company. He had never held a directorship. His name appeared on no incorporation papers, no board minutes, no publicly filed accounts. Yet the secondary sources, the memoirs of industrialists, the footnotes of legal histories, the occasional letter preserved in private collections, suggested consistently that behind several of the major Northumbrian mineral rights disputes of the 1870s and 1880s stood a figure who was described variously as a legal adviser of formidable acuity, a man who understood the art of the necessary document, and, in one candid private letter from a Durham coal magnate to his son, as the most dangerous clerk in England. He was, Holmes explained, spreading his notes across the sitting-room table, with the organised chaos of a man who knows exactly where everything is, a facilitator. The sort of man who exists in the penumbra of large commercial transactions, performing services that cannot be precisely named, but whose value is perfectly understood by all parties. Calvert used him, I believe, in the original acquisition of the Northumbrian iron rights. There were documents that needed to be, let us say, clarified. Fenwick clarified them. In exchange, Calvert paid him handsomely and entered into what Lady Calvert described as an ongoing arrangement. For 20 years this arrangement apparently satisfied both parties. "Until 6 months ago," I said. "Until 6 months ago. At which point, and here I am in the territory of inference rather than established fact, Watson, so attend carefully to what I know against what I'm supposing. Fenwick evidently decided to renegotiate. The question is why? What changed 6 months ago that altered the dynamic between a man who had been content with his arrangement for 2 decades? I thought about this. "The missing Board of Trade documents," I said slowly. "You said they related to the Northumbrian iron rights. If they contained evidence of the original irregularities—" "Precisely. If those documents revealed that the original licensing was obtained through falsified records that Fenwick had created or modified, then they represented a danger to both men. But they represented a greater danger to Calvert, who was the prominent public figure with a great deal more to lose by exposure, and a considerably lesser danger to Fenwick, who has spent his career ensuring that his name appears nowhere in print. The calculus of the arrangement had shifted. Fenwick held a new card. He threatened to expose Calvert unless Calvert paid more, or provided something more significant than money, something that Fenwick required and that only Calvert's position could supply. Holmes rose and moved to the fireplace, where he stood for a moment with his back to me, staring into the flames. And Calvert, finding himself in an impossible position, being bled by a man he could not expose without destroying himself, came to me, or was brought to me. The distinction in that final phrase stopped me. Was brought, I repeated. You believe Fenwick arranged for Calvert to come to Baker Street? I believe Fenwick gave Calvert a very good reason to consult me. Perhaps he told Calvert that I already had the documents, that someone had brought them to me, and that I was about to reveal their contents. A desperate man, believing that the one investigator most likely to unravel his affairs was already in possession of damaging evidence, might well come to Baker Street to negotiate, or to assess the danger. And Fenwick, who had simultaneously sent me away with a forged note and prepared this room for Calvert's arrival, used that brief window of privacy to kill Calvert and leave behind a scene that would implicate the one man who had any reason to investigate the matter. He kills two problems at once, I said, with a coldness that surprised me. Calvert, who has become an inconvenient liability, and you, who are already investigating the document theft. He attempts to, Holmes corrected, with a precision I found both reassuring and slightly unsettling. He has not yet succeeded on either count. The difficulty, as Holmes now laid it out with characteristic clarity, was one of evidence. Everything he had described was logically coherent, internally consistent, and very probably true. It was also, from a strictly evidentiary standpoint, almost entirely impossible to prove. Fenwick had constructed his scheme with the same meticulous care that he had evidently applied to 3 decades of legal manipulation, leaving behind no fingerprints, no witnesses, no document that bore his name or connected him definitively to either the murder or the forgery. The forged note found in Calvert's pocket, examined by Holmes with a glass that afternoon, was written on paper obtainable at any good stationer's. The cufflink on Calvert's wrist had been refastened by hands wearing gloves. And the forged Mycroft note that had drawn Holmes to Paddington had already been destroyed, as Holmes had. He admitted this with a slight compression of his lips that in him serves for an expression of self-reproach, burned it in the Paddington fireplace when it became clear that the address was a false one, a habit of tidiness that now struck him as having been inconvenient. But Fenwick had left one thing behind, one thing that, in the precise and careful choreography of his scheme, he had either overlooked or underestimated. Holmes drew from his jacket pocket a small, folded piece of paper, not the forged note, but something else, something he had not mentioned to Lestrade, something he had evidently taken from the sitting room during the brief interval between discovering the body and the arrival of the police. This, he said, unfolding it on the table between us, was on the floor beside the armchair, not under it, beside it, near the front right leg, as though it had fallen from a pocket or a cuff. I retrieved it before Lestrade arrived, which I acknowledge was technically an obstruction of justice, and I make no apology for it. He smoothed the paper flat. It was a small rectangle, printed rather than written, a railway ticket stub. Newcastle Central to King's Cross, 3rd class, issued yesterday morning. I looked at it. Fenwick came from Newcastle. Someone came from Newcastle yesterday. Fenwick has not been seen in Newcastle, or anywhere else with any certainty, in several years. But this tells us that whoever was in this room yesterday came on the morning train from the north. And there is one other thing. Holmes turned the ticket over. On the blank reverse, barely visible, as though a pen had been rested on this surface while writing something else on a piece of paper beneath it, there was a faint indentation, an impression of letters, ghostly but present. Holmes held it at an angle to the lamplight. "Can you read it?" I leaned close. The impression was partial, the letters uncertain, but with concentration one could distinguish Enwick, and below it, a number. 14 Ket. 14 Kettle, I began. Kettle Lane, Holmes said. It is a street in Whitechapel, and unless I'm very much mistaken, it is where Aldous Fenwick has been residing for the past several months under a name that is not his own, in the conviction that no one knows he is there. He folded the ticket carefully and returned it to his pocket. He's wrong about that. Chapter 6. Whitechapel at midnight, and the name on the register. Holmes did not, as I had half expected, propose an immediate descent upon Kettle Lane. This restraint was, I had learned over many years of our association, always more telling than urgency, for Holmes becomes cautious in direct proportion to the danger of a situation, and his caution on this occasion was pronounced. He spent the remainder of the afternoon and a considerable portion of the evening in what I can only describe as a systematic information-gathering exercise, dispatching no fewer than 11 notes via the Baker Street irregulars, those disreputable and invaluable small agents, to various contacts around the city, receiving replies with the rapidity that only those who have long experience with Holmes's network of informants can appreciate, and building from these various fragments a picture of Kettle Lane and its immediate environs that would have done credit to a military intelligence operation. Kettle Lane, it emerged, was a narrow and not particularly reputable street in the eastern reaches of Whitechapel, composed largely of lodging houses of the cheaper variety and small commercial premises of the kind that operate with a minimum of official documentation. Number 14 was a lodging house run by a woman who gave her name to the local traders as Mrs. Egan, who was known to be quiet and curious and not unreasonably priced. Her current lodgers included, according to the irregular who had managed to engage the landlady's neighbour's son in conversation over a game of marbles that afternoon, a travelling salesman from Birmingham, a retired seaman, 2 sisters who were seamstresses, and a quiet, well-spoken gentleman who had taken the top-floor room some 3 months ago and who paid in advance and received no visitors. 3 months, I noted. That would place his arrival approximately at the time when the Board of Trade documents went missing. Just so, Holmes said, without looking up from the street map he was annotating. A cautious man preparing his ground in advance of a significant move. He comes to London, establishes himself under a false identity in an area where his real name means nothing, and then, when the scheme has been arranged to his satisfaction, he executes it. But why come in person? Surely a man of his experience in managing things at a distance could have arranged this without exposing himself. Holmes looked up then, and his expression contained a kind of approval, as though I had asked precisely the right question. Because this scheme required things that cannot be arranged at a distance, he said. The forged note in my handwriting, that required close access, time, and probably several attempts. The preparation of this room, the drugged cup, that required someone to be physically present within these walls yesterday afternoon, while Mrs. Hudson was briefly in the back garden and I was at my writing. The management of Calvert in the final days required personal meetings. This could not be done by letter. Then he was here, in this room, yesterday. Yes, which means I may be able to tell you something about him. Holmes set down his pencil and in a movement so characteristic that I scarcely noticed it until it was complete, rose and moved to the armchair, not the dead man's chair but his own, which he occupied with the settled authority of a man reclaiming his proper territory. The mud on Calvert's right shoe, he said, reddish clay, inconsistent with the wet London pavements, but entirely consistent with the area around King's Cross Station, where the road works last week exposed a section of the older subsoil, a reddish, iron-rich clay that is characteristic of the geological layer beneath that part of the city. Calvert walked through it. He arrived at King's Cross, walked some distance on foot rather than taking a cab, unusual for a man of his wealth and station, suggesting he came on a train, not a carriage, and the reddish clay clung to his boot. He came from Newcastle on the same train as Fenwick, I said, or was instructed to take a train and to arrive on foot by whoever summoned him here. The detail about the cufflink interests me most, Watson. It was the left cufflink, improperly fastened, as though replaced in haste. Now, Calvert was right-handed. You can see it in the wear pattern of the jacket cuff, the slight asymmetry of his writing hand as suggested by the callus on the right middle finger. A right-handed man fastening his own left cufflink would use his right hand and would manage it with reasonable competence. The clumsiness suggests it was fastened by someone else, someone working quickly and not particularly familiar with the mechanism of that specific fastening. You think Calvert was already unconscious when the cufflink was replaced. I think the poison was administered quickly, that Calvert possibly had time to remove the cufflink himself, perhaps in distress, perhaps reaching for something, and that after his death, whoever was in this room replaced it improperly, concerned that a missing cufflink would suggest a struggle and complicate their carefully arranged scene. He paused. The scene was supposed to be Holmes invited Calvert, Holmes gave him poisoned tea, Holmes, having apparently temporarily lost his mind along with his ethics, then remained in the room with the body until Mrs. Hudson discovered them. It was never meant to be subtle. It was meant to be overwhelmingly, damningly obvious. The police were to arrive, find the evidence, and conclude the case before any alternative hypothesis could gain traction. But Holmes lingered, I said, and something about this made me rather glad, as foolish as that is. I returned before expected, he corrected. The scheme assumed I would remain in Paddington long enough for the scene to settle. Perhaps that I would make inquiries, wait, examine the false address thoroughly. I did not. I was back in Baker Street by 7:30, barely 30 minutes after the body was discovered. Fenwick had assumed a longer window. He got a shorter one. We went to Whitechapel at midnight. This was Holmes's decision, and it was a decision made with a particularity of timing that he declined to explain fully, saying only that midnight was when the respectable world was asleep and the other world was at its most transparent, which I took to mean that he had reasons both practical and psychological for the hour. He went in one of his disguises, a rather convincing representation of a gaunt and somewhat disreputable tradesman, which required only a change of jacket, a different posture, and the application of a small amount of theatrical grime to his hands and collar. I went as myself, which Holmes assured me was sufficiently unremarkable for the purpose. Kettle Lane at midnight was exactly what its address suggested. Narrow, damp, smelling of coal smoke and something less identifiable. The cobbles gleaming with the residue of the earlier fog. A single gas lamp at the near end doing its honest best against a darkness that had considerable advantages in the contest. Number 14 was a 4-story house of the compressed, slightly leaning variety that Whitechapel produces in abundance, its ground floor dark, its upper windows showing thin lines of light behind closed curtains. Holmes did not go to the front door. He led me instead down the narrow passage alongside the building to a back court shared by 4 houses, where a wooden external staircase gave access to the upper floors. He examined this staircase briefly with his dark lantern, then mounted it with a quietness that, even after years of such expeditions, I found remarkable. I followed, less quietly, my hand on the revolver in my pocket. The top-floor landing gave onto a single door. Holmes bent to the keyhole with the small set of instruments he carries for such occasions, and in approximately 45 seconds, I have timed this in the past from academic interest, the door opened. The room beyond was empty, not empty in the sense of unoccupied. There were clear signs of recent habitation, a bed recently slept in, clothes in the wardrobe, shaving materials on the washstand, but empty of its tenant, and more than that, on the table in the centre of the room, arranged with what I can only call a theatrical deliberateness, there was a single envelope, unsealed, propped against the inkstand. On the envelope, in a bold, angular hand, were written 2 words, Mr. Holmes. Chapter 7. The Letter That Changed Everything. Holmes picked up the envelope without visible surprise, which is the response one might expect from a man who has long since ceased to be surprised by the operational sophistication of serious opponents, and who has additionally, I suspect, developed a philosophical relationship with the unexpected that permits him to absorb it as data, rather than experience it as shock. He carried the envelope to the table, sat down in the room's single chair, and opened it under the beam of the dark lantern. I stood behind him and read over his shoulder. The letter was 2 pages long, written in the same bold, angular hand as the address on the envelope, in an ink that had dried to a dark brown black suggestive of quality and care. It read as follows: Mr. Holmes, you have found this room as I knew you would, and I find that I am torn between satisfaction at having been accurate in my prediction, and something rather more complicated at the knowledge that you are reading these words. I am aware that my departure tonight will be interpreted as confirmation of guilt, and I am also aware that this interpretation will, on the available evidence, be entirely correct. I did not kill Sir Edmund Calvert. I am, however, responsible for the circumstances of his death, and I find that distinction, which seemed important to me this morning, rather less comfortable to inhabit now that I am writing it down. What I will tell you is this: you are investigating the wrong murder. Calvert did not die because of anything I arranged. He died because of what he knew, not what he had done, which was considerable, but what he had discovered, approximately 10 days ago, concerning a person whose name I will not write in this letter, because I am not yet entirely certain that writing it here will not result in my own death before morning. This person has a name that would be familiar to you. They have a position in public life that makes them untouchable by conventional means, and they have been, for the past 18 months, engaged in an activity that makes the minor irregularities of the Calvert iron rights look like a schoolboy's mischief. I have been used. I will admit this without pleasure or excuses. I was hired to create the scene in Baker Street, to remove you, to bring Calvert there to arrange the evidence. I was told that Calvert would be frightened, that he would be confronted, and that the purpose of implicating you was to neutralize your investigation into the Board of Trade documents before it reached a conclusion that would be inconvenient. I was not told he would be killed. I am not, whatever you may have concluded, a murderer. I am a man who has over a long career performed services of a morally ambiguous nature for men of power and wealth. and I have made a comfortable peace with this, but I did not agree to this. The person who killed Calvert was in this room this morning. They came here after the morning papers were published, before I had left the city, and they told me what they had done. They told me that the scene had been set, that you were effectively neutralized, and that the remaining loose end, myself, would be managed in due course. At which point they smiled at me with a pleasantness that convinced me to leave London by the afternoon train. I did not take the afternoon train. I am not a fool. I will tell you one thing that may be of use. The Board of Trade documents were not stolen to protect Calvert. They were stolen to protect what was in them. Specifically, a licensing record that appears to be authentic but is not, and that establishes the mineral rights to a set of properties currently the subject of a government acquisition. The man who forged that record is not me. I have forged documents in my time, Mr. Holmes, but I did not forge this one. The forgery is older than my involvement, it predates everything, and the person who forged it, who has spent 20 years ensuring it remains unexamined, is the same person who killed Calvert when Calvert discovered the truth, and is the same person who attempted to destroy you as a precaution, and is the same person who will, if they have their way, walk away from this entire affair entirely clean, the name I will not write. But I will tell you where to look. The Deed of Assignment for the Hartmore Valley Mineral Rights, September 1877. The signatory whose name appears as a witness on the third page is not the man it claims to be. The real man had been dead for 6 weeks when that document was signed. The signature is a forgery of the living kind, made by someone who was alive and available, and who had the access and the technical skill. Find that person, Mr. Holmes, and you will find your killer. I will be somewhere that is not England. I apologize for the inconvenience. A.E. Holmes set the letter down on the table and sat without speaking for a period I would estimate at 2 full minutes, which in the context of active investigation represents an unusually sustained pause for reflection. I read the letter through twice while he sat, and when I finished I looked up at his profile, sharp in the lamplight, and waited. The Deed of Assignment, I said at last. September 1877. This is what the Board of Trade documents contained. It is what one of them contained, Holmes agreed, and it is what was stolen, specifically and surgically extracted from among dozens of other papers, because someone knew it was there and knew that its extraction needed to happen before a man with my inclination toward detail examined it. He picked up the letter again and reread the final paragraph. The witness signature. A living man forging the name of a dead one. He was quiet for a moment. Forging the signature of a dead man who has been dead 6 weeks. Who would know, in 1877, that a particular man had been dead for 6 weeks? Someone in that man's professional circle, someone in legal practice perhaps, someone who had access to probate records, or was informed of the death through professional channels. A solicitor, I said, or a solicitor's clerk. Fenwick began as a solicitor's clerk, Holmes said, and then shook his head once. But he says he did not forge it, and he goes to some trouble to make that clear. It would have been simpler to omit it. I am inclined provisionally to believe him. He rose from the chair and moved toward the door. The real forger is someone with access to that level of documentation in 1877, someone who has spent 20 years ensuring the document remains unexamined, and someone who was willing to commit murder when its security was threatened. We are looking for a man, or woman, who has been hiding in plain sight for 2 decades. We descended the back staircase in silence and made our way back through the Whitechapel streets, toward the main road and a cab. The night had cleared since midnight, and the stars were visible between the buildings, cold and precise as always, indifferent to the particular dramas being conducted below them. I thought, as I sometimes do in the small hours after an evening of Holmes's company, about the sheer weight of concealed human history, the lies and their consequences, the arrangements and their unravelling, that any given city street contains if one only knows how to look. Holmes, I said, when we had found a cab and given Baker Street as our destination. Fenwick said the name would be familiar to you. Someone in public life. Yes. The monosyllable was rich with implication but characteristically uninformative. Do you know who it is? Holmes turned and looked at me in the darkness of the cab interior, and his grey eyes had the particular quality I associate with those moments when the pattern has resolved but the outcome remains uncertain. I have a hypothesis, he said carefully. But it is a hypothesis of a kind that requires absolute certainty before it can be spoken aloud, because if I am wrong, the damage to an innocent person would be severe, and if I am right— He turned back to the window, where the street lamps were beginning to thin toward Baker Street. The damage to a guilty one must be equally severe, and I intend to be entirely sure of my ground before I deliver it. Chapter 8. 3 days in which Holmes was everywhere at once. The 3 days that followed were, in my experience of Holmes's methods, among the most concentrated and outwardly inscrutable periods I have ever witnessed. He slept, I believe, a total of perhaps 9 hours across the 3 nights, 8 at irregular intervals, whatever Mrs. Hudson placed in front of him, with an absent-mindedness that suggested he was tasting something quite other than food, and moved in and out of Baker Street at hours and in disguises that I eventually abandoned trying to track or anticipate. When he was in the sitting room, he was reading archives, newspaper files, legal directories, the records of the Inns of Court, 2 large volumes of property law, with a concentration so absolute that I several times entered the room, observed his presence, withdrew to my study, and later discovered I had no clear memory of any detail of his appearance in those intervening moments, so completely had he absorbed himself into the material. He permitted me, during this period, to undertake several specific tasks. He sent me to Somerset House to examine the probate records for the year 1877, with a list of 18 names and instructions to identify which of them had been admitted to probate between June and December of that year, with particular attention to any with legal or commercial connections to the Northumbrian mineral trade. He sent me to the British Museum reading room to locate and transcribe every available biographical notice of a man called Reginald Ashmore, who had been a commissioner at the Board of Trade in the relevant period, and who had died in 1889. And he sent me on the second afternoon to a pawnbroker's in Clerkenwell, not to transact any business, but to observe the proprietor and report back on his general appearance, the condition of his hands, and any particularly unusual items visible in the front window. I undertook all of this with the willing bewilderment that is the customary condition of Watson during investigation, understanding perhaps a third of what I was being asked to observe, trusting that the significance would be made clear in due time, and consoling myself with the knowledge that Holmes's methods, however obscure in process, are invariably precise in outcome. The probate records yielded something immediately interesting. Of the 18 names on Holmes's list, 7 had been admitted to probate in the second half of 1877. Of these 7, 3 had legal or commercial connections to the Northumbrian mineral trade. Of these 3, 1, a solicitor named Gerald Portnell, who had been a partner in the Newcastle firm of Callaway and Portnell, had died in August 1877, exactly 6 weeks before the date of the Hartmore Valley deed. His probate record indicated a modest estate, an unmarried state, and a single named executor, a junior partner at the same firm whose name I recorded and brought back to Holmes. The biographical material on Ashmore was less immediately useful, but contained a detail that Holmes, when I read it to him, received with the quality of attention he brings to things that confirm a direction of thought rather than introducing a new one. Ashmore had served at the Board of Trade between 1874 and 1881, with particular responsibility for the Northern Industrial Licensing portfolio. He had left the Board of Trade under circumstances that the available sources described as retirement, but that the private correspondence of his successor, excerpted in a memoir characterized as an irregular but ultimately unprovable situation, involving the co-signing of documents whose authenticity was subsequently, and quietly, questioned. He had died, as noted, in 1889, taking whatever knowledge he possessed to a grave that was, if this account was accurate, rather more peacefully occupied than it deserved. The Clerkenwell pawnbroker proved to be the most immediately productive of my errands, though not in the way I had anticipated. The proprietor was a small, neat man of about 65, with the hands of someone who has handled fine objects all his life. Careful hands, precise in their movements, with an artisan's unconscious competence. And in the front window, among the usual jumble of unredeemed pledges, was a small collection of silver items, several sets of cufflinks, a cigarette case, a watch chain, and, this I noted carefully and reported to Holmes with what I hoped was an appropriate emphasis, a pair of silver cufflinks of the plain, heavy variety, with a distinctive mechanism of the rotating clasp type, that were, if I was not entirely mistaken, of exactly the same pattern as the left cufflink I had observed improperly fastened on the body of Sir Edmund Calvert. Holmes, when I reported this, was silent for a moment and then said, "When were they brought in?" I'd thought to ask this, fortunately. "Yesterday morning," I said. "The proprietor was not certain of the exact hour, but he said before noon. He paid 3 shillings for them." "One cufflink or 2? I blinked. I did not specifically ask. I assumed, "Go back," Holmes said, "and ask. I believe you will find there is only one. The other," he paused, "may be rather more interesting in its current location." I went back. There was, as Holmes had anticipated, only one cufflink. The proprietor, when pressed, recalled that the gentleman who had sold it had seemed briefly surprised himself to find there was only one, as though he had reached into a pocket expecting two and found one, and had accepted the lesser price rather than prolong the transaction. The proprietor described him as well-dressed, perhaps 50 to 55, grey-haired, carrying a good umbrella, with something about his bearing that suggested military or official service. When I relayed this description to Holmes that evening, he made no comment other than to look up from his reading with an expression that was not quite satisfaction, more like the controlled recognition of a careful man who is 3/4 of the way through a calculation and can see that the answer is going to be what he suspected. He returned to his reading. I went to bed earlier than usual, having learned over many years that attempting to remain useful to Holmes at the stage when he is close to a conclusion is the most reliable way of being genuinely useless to him. On the morning of the third day, Holmes appeared at breakfast in his usual clothes, shaved, alert, and with the specific quality of stillness that in him precedes action rather than follows exhaustion. He ate toast with apparent appetite. He drank 2 cups of coffee. He read the morning paper, which contained a brief notice that Scotland Yard was making progress in the Calvert investigation, and that an arrest was expected shortly, a notice that caused him to set down the paper with an almost imperceptible quickening of his expression. Lestrade, he said, is about to arrest the wrong person, probably Fenwick in absentia, on the strength of his disappearance and the railway ticket, which he knows about through channels I prefer not to examine too carefully. We have, I would estimate, 48 hours before the formal announcement of charges makes it considerably more difficult to pursue the truth without appearing to be engaged in obstruction rather than investigation. He folded his napkin with precision. Today, Watson, we set our trap, and we require the cooperation of 3 people, Lestrade, Lady Calvert, and my brother. Mycroft, I said. Is he involved? He has been involved, Holmes said, since before either of us knew it. He simply did not know what he was involved in. He pushed back his chair. The junior partner, he said, the name you brought from the probate records, the executor of Gerald Portnell's estate. Do you recall it? I did recall it. It had been an ordinary enough name, the kind of name that belongs to the second tier of professional life, distinguished enough to be respectable, undistinguished enough to be invisible. I spoke it aloud. Holmes nodded slowly, as though I had confirmed the final syllable of a sentence he had been composing in his mind for 3 days. Yes, he said. That is our man. Chapter 9. The Machinery of a Perfect Deception. The name Holmes had confirmed was that of Mr. Harrington Fossey, a name that will mean little to most readers, but that, once Holmes had drawn its full significance from the documentary and circumstantial evidence he had assembled over those 3 days, revealed itself as belonging to a figure of remarkable and carefully concealed consequence. Fossey had been, in 1877, the junior partner and executor of the firm of Callaway and Portnell in Newcastle. He was now, in 1897, a senior figure in the office of the Commissioner for Crown Lands and Mineral Rights in London, a position of exactly the bureaucratic obscurity and practical power that Holmes had described when outlining the profile of their quarry, a man in public life, whose name would be known to Holmes, who was untouchable by conventional means. Fossey had served in his current capacity for 11 years. He had been appointed during the administration that had succeeded the government, which oversaw the original Northumbrian mineral rights licensing, appointed specifically to oversee the administration of those very licenses, in a move that, in retrospect, had the shape of a very deliberate placement. He was 53, grey-haired, carried a good umbrella. I recognised the pawnbroker's description with a chill, and had the bearing, as I was able to establish from a brief biographical sketch in a professional directory, of a former officer in the Volunteers, with an interest in numismatics and a reputation within his department as exacting, thorough, and entirely unimpeachable. 20 years, Holmes said, spreading his notes before us on the sitting-room table where he had arranged them with the cartographic exactitude he brings to the reconstruction of complex criminal architecture. 20 years of managing this particular file within the government apparatus, ensuring that the relevant documents are never examined too closely, that the license renewals proceed routinely, that any inquiry that comes near the subject is redirected or delayed until it loses momentum. It is a masterpiece of administrative concealment, Watson. You have to admire the patience of it, even as you deplore the application. I studied the timeline Holmes had constructed. In 1877, Fossey, then 29, ambitious, and evidently not encumbered by excessive scruple, had forged the witness signature of his recently deceased senior partner, Gerald Portnell, on the Hartmore Valley mineral rights deed. allowing the deed to pass inspection and vest the rights in Calvert under terms that Calvert had purchased at a significant price from Fossey's private arrangement. In 1878, Fossey had moved to London and inserted himself into the bureaucratic structure that oversaw such rights. By 1886, he had manoeuvred himself into the specific position from which he could most effectively manage the continued burial of his original crime. For 11 years, the arrangement had worked with the silent efficiency of all well-constructed crimes. The disruption had come, as Holmes had surmised, from an unexpected direction. The government's recent interest in acquiring the Northumbrian properties for a national railway expansion had generated a new and unusually thorough examination of the mineral rights title. This examination had been assigned to a young solicitor who, unlike his predecessors, was both meticulous and unfamiliar with the informal understanding that certain files were to be treated with a particular delicacy. This solicitor had noticed an anomaly in the 1877 deed, specifically that the witness signature was dated 6 weeks after the witness in question was demonstrably dead, and had flagged it through channels. The flag had reached Fossey's department. Fossey had removed the relevant documents from the Board of Trade files, but by then Calvert, who had been informed of the examination as a courtesy by his own solicitors, had already been made aware of the anomaly and had begun to understand its implications. Calvert confronted Fossey, I said, following the narrative. Or threatened to. Calvert engaged Fenwick, Holmes corrected. The old arrangement between them, Calvert had been paying Fenwick for 20 years as insurance as a professional fixer, as someone who could manage exactly this kind of complication. He went to Fenwick and said, in essence, "There is a problem with the foundation of my title, and someone in government is responsible." Fenwick, who had his own knowledge of the original arrangement, and who therefore knew exactly who Fossey was and what he had done, reached out to Fossey. And Fossey, who had been managing legal complexities for 20 years, and who was not, I suspect, greatly alarmed by the initial contact, made a catastrophic miscalculation. He assumed Fenwick could be bought off or managed the same way the documents had been managed, I said. Precisely. Instead, he found himself confronting a man who was not seeking money but information. Fenwick had been contacted by a private inquiry agent, possibly connected to the solicitor who had identified the anomaly, and had realised that the landscape was shifting in ways that Calvert's payments could not address. And then Holmes, he smiled slightly at the peculiarity of referring to himself in the third person, entered the picture. Mycroft's request that I look into the document theft reached me approximately 1 week after Fenwick made contact with Fossey. Fossey, when he became aware that I was investigating, understood that the margin of safety had collapsed. The scheme that emerged, eliminating Calvert, who might talk, incapacitating me, who might deduce, was not Fenwick's idea. Fenwick's letter makes this clear, and I believe it. The scheme was Foss's. And Fenwick agreed to it, believing it was a strategy of intimidation rather than murder, I said, recalling the letter. He agreed to perform the logistical elements, the forged note, the scene preparation, the management of Calvert's arrival, believing that Foss intended to use the tableau merely to frighten, discredit, or delay. When he understood that Foss had actually killed Calvert during the window Fenwick himself had created, he found himself simultaneously an unwitting accessory and a liability. Hence his flight. Hence the letter, which is his attempt to establish, for whatever post hoc value it might have, that he did not know murder was intended. The trap Holmes proposed was elegant and pitiless, as his traps tend to be when the quarry has demonstrated themselves to be both dangerous and intelligent. He spent the morning in conference with Mycroft, who arrived at Baker Street in his usual ponderous and unhurried way. Listened to Holmes's account with the expression of a man reviewing accounts he has already suspected were irregular, and agreed to assist with the quiet authority of someone who understands that certain actions must be taken outside the official record before they can be safely brought within it. He spent the afternoon in conference with Lestrade, who accepted the outline of the plan with the combination of relief and bruised professional pride that I have come to recognise as his characteristic response to Holmes's solutions, gratitude somewhat complicated by the fact that he had been looking in entirely the wrong direction for 3 days. And he spent the evening writing a letter. One letter, on Baker Street notepaper, in his own hand, genuine this time, with no American spelling conventions, and he sealed it, addressed it to Mr. Harrington Fossey at his office in the office of the Commissioner for Crown Lands, and handed it to me with an expression that I can only describe as deliberately opaque. "What does it say?" I asked. "It says," Holmes replied, "that I have found the Hartmore Valley deed, the original, not the one from the Board of Trade which Fossey has destroyed, but a second copy that was retained, as is standard practice in the legal archives, by the original solicitor's firm. He paused. There is, of course, no such second copy, or rather, there is now. Mycroft has arranged it. I stared at him. You have fabricated evidence. Mycroft has facilitated the creation of a piece of paper that does not yet exist as an official document, but that contains entirely accurate information about what the original document said, Holmes said, with a precision that walked a very careful line. Whether that constitutes fabrication is a philosophical question that I leave to persons with more leisure than we currently possess. What it will do is bring Harrington Foss to Baker Street tomorrow evening, alone, under the assumption that he is coming to negotiate, assess, or eliminate the last evidence against him. And when he arrives... Holmes settled back in his chair with the focused calm of a man who has wound the mechanism and is waiting for it to run. We will be rather better prepared to receive him than we were for Sir Edmund Calvert. Chapter 10. The Man Who Came to Negotiate. The following evening arrived with the punctual, indifferent cruelty of time which does not adjust its pace to accommodate either the innocent or the guilty. I'd spent the day in a state of composed but genuine anxiety, the particular variety of anxiety that accompanies situations where the expected outcome is dangerous but preferable to all the alternatives. Holmes had spent it in apparent serenity, which I've learned over many years is not a false front but simply the natural condition of a man who has done everything in his power to prepare a situation and is content to allow it to unfold. By 7:30, our preparations were complete. Lestrade was in the back bedroom with the door to the landing held slightly ajar, his presence there a concession to the legitimate demands of justice and the practical necessity of having a witness whose testimony would be admissible. Mycroft Broom, who had insisted on attending in the capacity of what he called an interested observer, and what Holmes called a safety measure against the unexpected, occupied Mrs. Hudson's parlour on the ground floor, having negotiated this position with the landlady in terms that I did not hear, but that resulted in Mrs. Hudson departing to her sister's for the evening with an expression of long-suffering acceptance. And I was in my customary chair by the fireplace, with my revolver in my jacket pocket and a cup of tea in my hand, which Holmes had pointed out would look considerably more natural than the revolver if our visitor arrived earlier than expected. Holmes himself was at his desk, apparently reading, a performance of normality sufficiently convincing that I suspect it was not entirely performance. Harrington Fossey arrived at 8 o'clock. We heard him at the front door, a brisk, confident knock, not the knock of a frightened man, and then Mrs. Hudson's absence produced a brief silence before Holmes went to the head of the stairs and called down an invitation. I heard the door open, the sound of a good umbrella being set in the stand, a measured tread on the staircase. When Fossey entered the sitting room, I understood immediately why he had managed for 2 decades to remain invisible. He was precisely what the pawnbroker had described, and no more than that. A well-presented man of middle age with the grey temples and the steady, assessing gaze of a senior civil servant of the better variety. He looked, in short, entirely trustworthy. He looked like a man you would ask to hold your coat. He registered my presence with a slight adjustment of his composure. He had clearly expected Holmes alone, and said, "Dr. Watson, I was not aware you would be joining us." "Dr. Watson is always present at significant consultations," Holmes said pleasantly, from his chair, which he had not risen from. "Please sit down. I expect you will want to discuss the matter directly." Fossey sat. He looked around the room with the unhurried attention of someone making a professional assessment, and I noticed his gaze rest for a moment on the armchair where Calvert had died. Now returned to its usual position, the room restored to its ordinary appearance. Whatever the armchair's significance meant to him, it showed in nothing more than a fractional stillness of his expression, gone before it could be called a reaction. "Your letter," he said. "The Hartmore Valley deed." "The Hartmore Valley deed," Holmes agreed. "Specifically, the retained copy held by the successor firm to Calloway and Portnell, a document which, as you no doubt immediately recognised, contains a witness signature dated 6 weeks after Gerald Portnell was certified dead by his physician and buried in St Andrew's churchyard in Newcastle." Holmes said this in the mild, conversational tone that he uses when stating facts he considers beyond dispute. A signature written by someone who was alive at the time of the deed, who had access to Portnell's signing style, and who was the sole executor of his estate. "You, Mr. Fossey?" A long silence. Fossey's hands, resting on his knees, were very still, the same species of stillness I had observed in Holmes 2 nights ago. The controlled immobility of someone who is thinking at considerable speed. "If such a document exists," Fossey said carefully, Its provenance would need to be very thoroughly established before it could be considered evidential. Of course, Holmes said, and it will be. Mycroft's office has already taken custody of it, which means its provenance will be established with a thoroughness that I imagine you find rather more alarming than the document itself. Another silence. Something shifted in Fosse's face. Not quite fear, but the recognition of a man who has just understood the full dimensions of the position he occupies. "What is it you want?" he said. "The truth," Holmes said simply. "Not for my personal satisfaction, though I confess that plays some part. For Sir Edmund Calvert, who is dead. And for the rather more practical purpose of clearing my own name from whatever residual suspicion attaches to it as a result of your arrangements last week." "I don't know what you mean about arrangements," Fosse said, but the denial had lost something. A fraction of its conviction, a shade of its steadiness. The face of a man reciting words rather than speaking them. "The forged note in Calvert's pocket," Holmes said, counting on his fingers with pleasant precision. "The forged note to my brother that drew me to Paddington. The drugged cup prepared for my possible early return. The railway journey from Newcastle, 3rd class, which struck me as modestly excessive, given that your department's salary would easily accommodate first, but which was perhaps calculated to produce exactly the appearance of Fenwick that you intended." He paused. "Fenwick, incidentally, is no longer in England, and the letter he left behind is thoroughly documented and in safe hands. Whatever you intended to do about Fenwick, the window for it has passed." Fosse was quiet for a moment. Then, with the deliberate movement of a man accepting the terms of a situation he cannot change, he put his hands flat on his knees and looked at Holmes with an expression that had resolved itself, surprisingly, into something approaching calm. "Calvert was going to go to the Board of Trade," he said, "not to report the irregularity, but to use it. He had engaged people, had evidence prepared. He was going to present it as a scandal of government corruption, and use the publicity to resist the Crown acquisition of the properties. He intended to be untouchable." A pause. "I could not allow that." "So you killed him?" "I administered a dose of potassium cyanide to a man who was going to destroy 20 years of careful management in a fit of commercial pique," Fosse said, with a precision that was almost academic. "In a setting that would direct attention away from me and toward the one person most likely to investigate the matter and find the truth." He looked at Holmes with something that, absurdly, had the quality of professional appreciation. "I underestimated the speed of your return and the persistence of your methods." "Most people do," Holmes said, "on both counts." The door from the landing opened, and Lestrade came in, not dramatically, not with the self-conscious flourish that fiction tends to assign to such moments, but with the quiet, determined step of a professional doing his job. Fosse looked at him and at the constable behind him, with the same composed expression he had worn throughout. He rose without being asked. "Mr. Harrington Fosse," Lestrade said, "I am arresting you for the wilful murder of Sir Edmund Calvert, Baronet." He paused as though about to add something, then simply said, "Will you come quietly?" "I have always," said Fosse, with what I can only describe as an awful dignity, "been a quiet man." And he went with Lestrade without resistance, his hands clasped behind his back as though he were walking to a meeting rather than out of his freedom, down the stairs of 221B Baker Street and into the cold November night. Chapter 11. The Resolution of Several Threads. The days that followed the arrest of Harrington Fosse had the quality that I have come to associate with the aftermath of Holmes's more complex cases. Not relief, exactly, which tends to be a simpler and shorter-lived emotion, but a gradual, almost reluctant return to the ordinary, like a landscape resolving out of fog, detail by detail, until it is simply the landscape again, and the drama of the obscured version is already becoming memory. Holmes slept for 14 hours on the night after Fosse's arrest, which I took as a reliable index of the degree of concentrated expenditure the case had demanded. When he woke, he ate an enormous breakfast and read the morning papers with the detached satisfaction of a man reviewing a piece of work he considers essentially complete. The newspapers, for their part, had the story with a fervour that testified to its inherent sensational qualities. A senior government official arrested for the murder of an industrial baronet, the case having briefly and dramatically implicated the detective investigating it, the whole affair shot through with 20 years of hidden crime and administrative concealment. It was, I will confess, rather excellent copy. Holmes read the accounts without comment, pausing once to note that the Daily Telegraph's reconstruction of the original document forgery was almost accurate, and once to observe that the Morning Post had confused Fenwick with another person entirely, and would presumably be receiving a solicitor's letter within the week. Lestrade came on the second morning, unbidden, and sat in the chair across from Holmes with an expression that navigated carefully between official satisfaction and private gratitude. He was a decent man in his way, Lestrade, and he was honest enough about his own limitations not to require Holmes to be tactful about them. "I was going to charge Fenwick," he said, without preamble. "Yes," Holmes said. "On the evidence available to me, it was the logical conclusion." "It was a logical conclusion," Holmes agreed. "The indefinite article doing considerable quiet work. The evidence against Fenwick was substantial and consistent. The evidence against Foss was thin to the point of non-existence until one knew where to look. You cannot be fairly blamed for looking where the evidence pointed." Lestrade was quiet for a moment, turning his hat in his hands. "The forged note. In your handwriting? How did he manage it?" "Practice, I assume, over a period of weeks. He had access to documents bearing my signature through legitimate channels. I have been in correspondence with his department, indirectly, through Mycroft's office, on several occasions. He studied those documents, practiced the hand, and produced a creditable imitation. The American spelling of require was the one slip, a trivial error but sufficient for our purposes. A man who forges documents for practical rather than artistic reasons tends to focus on the visual appearance of the signature and the general character of the writing, and to pay less attention to the incidental conventions of spelling and phrasing." He paused. "It is a characteristic of the technically skilled forger who lacks what I might call documentary intuition, the understanding that a document is not only a visual artifact but a linguistic one." "The cufflink," I said. "This had been occupying me. You said the missing one would be in an interesting location." Holmes smiled slightly. "It was found by Lestrade's men in the grate of the first-floor fireplace at Fossey's office, partially melted. He had attempted to destroy it, having realized it was missing when he visited the pawnbroker. The silver was identifiable by its distinctive clasp mechanism, which survived the heat. It was, in the end, the most concrete physical evidence connecting Foss to the scene, though by the time Lestrade's people found it, Fossey had already made his confession in the interview room, which rather simplified matters. Lady Calvert, to whom Holmes sent a brief note on the morning after the arrest, explaining the outcome in its essential terms, received the information with what her brief written reply described as a mixture of grief and, I confess, relief, which I find difficult to reconcile but am attempting to accept. She made no claim to have been unaware of her husband's original transaction with Fenwick. Her confession to Holmes during their interview that she had known something was irregular in the business's foundations appeared in none of the official records by Holmes's quiet arrangement. She was a widow with 2 children and a legitimate sorrow, and he saw no purpose in compounding it. Fenwick, Aldous Fenwick, the ghost with footprints, the arranger of inconvenient situations, was never located. Holmes received, some 6 weeks later, a brief note postmarked from an address in Lisbon, containing no message beyond a single line. I trust the matter has been satisfactorily resolved. A.F. Holmes read it, burned it in the fireplace and said nothing. I asked him once whether Fenwick should be pursued, and he considered the question for a moment before saying that Fenwick had, in a very specific sense, assisted in the resolution of the case, that he was an old man who had chosen an unusual profession and conducted it according to a code that was consistent if not admirable, and that the pursuit of a man who was genuinely guilty only of being present in the wrong architecture at the wrong time required a moral clarity he was not certain the situation warranted. Lestrade, when Holmes communicated the bare fact that Fenwick had been in contact but provided no actionable information, accepted this with the pragmatism of a man who has other cases pressing on his attention. The Board of Trade documents were reconstructed from secondary sources and the Mycroft-facilitated copy, which vanished from the official record with the efficiency that tends to characterize Mycroft's domestic arrangements. The Hartmore Valley mineral rights were referred to the appropriate legal authority for review. Whether the Crown's acquisition of the Northumbrian properties would proceed, and on what terms, was a matter that Holmes declined to speculate about, on the grounds that it was a bureaucratic and political question, and those were, as he put it, areas where his confidence in the intelligibility of events was appropriately limited. Fossey was tried the following spring. The trial lasted 4 days and produced a verdict that surprised no one who had followed the evidence. He was a composed defendant, precise and almost academic in his answers, maintaining to the end a quality of controlled dignity that the press found either admirable or sinister, depending on their editorial inclinations. He received the sentence appropriate to his crime and was removed from the public record as thoroughly as he had, for so many years, ensured that certain other documents were removed from public scrutiny. There is a kind of justice in this, I suppose, though. It is the cold, symmetrical kind, which is not the same thing as satisfaction. The cloud that had briefly, very briefly, though even briefly was insupportable, attached to Holmes's name was dispersed by the arrest and the subsequent account, which made clear beyond any possible doubt not only Holmes's innocence, but the sophistication of the scheme that had been designed to compromise it. Lestrade, in his official report, was generous, the press were enthusiastic, and Holmes, typically, was neither interested in nor particularly affected by the restoration of a reputation whose temporary compromise he had treated throughout as an inconvenience rather than a wound. Baker Street returned, as it always does, to itself. The chemical experiments resumed their slow warfare with the surface of the deal table. The violin recommenced its irregular but genuine music. The files and indexes accumulated their new entries. The irregulars came and went with the comfortable irregularity of irregular things, and I settled back into the role that years of friendship with Holmes had made as natural to me as breathing. Witness, companion, occasional Watson, perpetual astonishment. Chapter 12. A quiet evening and a philosophical remark. It was perhaps a fortnight after Fossey's arrest that I called at Baker Street one evening without particular purpose or appointment. Drawn by the habit of friendship and the less definable quality that Holmes's company possesses, a kind of intellectual warmth that is neither comfortable nor predictable, but that, once known, becomes something one misses when it's absent. The November fog had given way to a December cold of the clear, bright variety, and Baker Street had the polished, hard-edged look of a city under frost, the gas lamps burning with unusual clarity, and the footsteps of passers-by ringing on the pavement with a precision that the fog had previously muffled. Holmes was in his armchair, his own chair, the one he has always occupied, returned to its proper dominion, with his long legs extended toward the fire and his violin across his lap. He was not playing it, merely touching the strings with one finger in the absent, exploratory way that sometimes precedes music, and sometimes simply reflects a mind that is not, at this moment, elsewhere. He looked up when I entered, nodded with the moderate satisfaction of a man who has expected this visit, and finds the expectation confirmed, and gestured toward the opposite chair. I sat. Mrs. Hudson brought tea. We sat in silence for a while, which is, with Holmes, never actually silence in the sense of absence. There is always the quality of active thought about his stillness, as though the air around him carries a faint charge, but which is comfortable in the way that certain kinds of companionship are comfortable, requiring nothing, offering much. "You're thinking about the case," I said, after a time. "I'm thinking about several things simultaneously," Holmes replied. "A capacity you are always somewhat surprised by, Watson, though I should think 20 years of acquaintance might have accustomed you to it. The very faintest quality of amusement in this, which from Holmes I have learned to receive as a form of affection. I'm thinking about Fossey, about Fenwick, about the particular species of intelligence that devotes itself entirely to concealment. What aspect of it?" He ran his finger once, slowly, along the strings of the violin. "There is a kind of mind," he said, "that is genuinely extraordinary in its capacity for management, organization, and forward calculation, but that applies these gifts exclusively to the service of a single, finite goal. In Fossey's case, the preservation of one document and the comfortable career built upon it. 20 years of sustained, sophisticated effort, 20 years of successful concealment, and all of it ultimately futile, because the thing being preserved was rotten at the foundation, and rotten things, given sufficient time and sufficient pressure, will always crack." "You almost sound sorry for him," I said. Holmes considered this with the attention he brings to questions about his own interior states, which he finds genuinely difficult to map. "Not sorry," he said at last, "something more like interested by the waste of it." He was not unintelligent, Fossey. The original crime at 29 was the act of an ambitious young man in a hurry, and I can reconstruct the reasoning that led to it even if I cannot endorse it. But 20 years of subsequent management, the accumulation of precautions, the steady vigilance, the gradual institutionalizing of a lie, that required something more than mere ambition. It required a kind of dedication that, properly applied, might have built something rather than preserved nothing. "You think about this with all of them," I said. "The serious criminals, what they might have been." "Only the interesting ones," Holmes said. "The others are simply problems." He plucked one string of the violin very softly, and the note hung in the warm air of the sitting room for a moment before dispersing. The truly dangerous criminals, the architects of sustained deception, invariably have qualities that, in another moral frame, would be admirable: patience, foresight, the capacity to maintain a complex dynamic system under varying conditions of external pressure. These are not common gifts, Watson. They are simply gifts that have been employed in the service of concealment rather than discovery. And that is the difference between you and them, I said. Discovery rather than concealment. He looked at me for a moment with an expression that was harder to read than usual. Not warm exactly, but attentive in a way that went slightly beyond the analytical. That is a generous formulation, he said, and probably a true one. Though I would add one qualification: the method is not merely discovery for its own sake. There must be something worth discovering, a truth that matters. Without that, without the thing that Foss killed Calvert to prevent anyone from knowing, the exercise would be merely academic. He settled back in his chair. Calvert was not, by any measure, a good man. His original acquisition was fraudulent. His ongoing relationship with Fenwick was corrupt. He was coming to me in the end, not out of civic virtue, but to protect his own interests against a more powerful threat. And yet he did not deserve to die for any of this, and the truth of what killed him did not become less important, because the man was imperfect. Truth regardless of its beneficiaries, I said. Truth regardless of its beneficiaries, Holmes agreed. That is, I think, the principle that justifies the whole enterprise. If we only pursued justice on behalf of the entirely virtuous, we would have very little to do. The entirely virtuous are, in my experience, insufficiently interesting to attract serious criminal attention. He picked up the violin properly now, tucking it beneath his chin, and drew the bow across the strings in the opening phrase of a Bach partita, something slow and intricate, with the quality of a mathematical proof being demonstrated by someone who finds both the mathematics and the proof deeply pleasurable. I leaned back in my chair and listened, and watched the firelight moving on the familiar walls of the room, and thought about truth and its beneficiaries, and about the extraordinary, tiresome, irreplaceable man sitting across from me, who had been accused of murder in his own sitting room and had resolved the matter in 6 days, and who was now playing back as though nothing particularly unusual had occurred. After several minutes, Holmes lifted the bow from the strings, the music ending mid-phrase in the way that characterizes his playing when a thought intervenes. "The note Fenwick wrote," he said, without preamble. "The line about the wrong murder. He said I was investigating the wrong murder. Do you know, Watson, I have been considering that phrase, because strictly speaking, the murder I was investigating was not wrong. It was simply not the primary crime. The primary crime was the forgery. The murder was a consequence of someone trying to preserve the forgery, and the attempt on my reputation was a consequence of someone trying to prevent the murder being investigated." He tapped the bow against his knee, once thinking. "It is turtles all the way down, as the Americans say. Each deception requires a larger one to maintain it. Each crime requires a more significant one to conceal it. The original sin, Foss's pencil on a sheet of paper in 1877, writing a dead man's name, generated 20 years of compounding liability until the weight of it became unsustainable and the whole structure collapsed. The lesson being, I said, that the initial cost of honesty is invariably lower than the eventual cost of concealment, Holmes said. But I should not lecture on this subject, Watson, as it is one on which I am perhaps imperfectly positioned to claim moral authority. This last with the slight self-aware irony that he occasionally permits himself, and that I have always found, in its restraint, more genuinely disarming than more demonstrative forms of self-deprecation. He raised the violin again and continued the partita from where he had interrupted it, picking up the phrase with the uncanny accuracy of a mind that retains everything, and played for perhaps half an hour, the music filling the sitting room with something that was not quite contentment, and not quite peace, but was adjacent to both, in the way that Baker Street in December is adjacent to warmth. Not warm itself, but close enough that one forgets to feel the cold. I did not return to Kensington until nearly 11, and I walked part of the way, which I had not intended when I set out, but which the night air and the clarity of the frost made appealing enough, that I continued past the point where a cab would have been sensible. London at that hour has a particular quality that I have always found difficult to describe precisely, the way the emptied streets reveal the bones of the city, its geometry and its scale, usually hidden by the daytime crowd. I thought about Holmes, as I often do during solitary walks, with the mixture of admiration and bafflement and affection that has characterized my feeling toward him for 20 years. I thought about what he had said, truth regardless of its beneficiaries, and about the dead baronet and the careful civil servant and the old fixer in Lisbon, and about the single forged signature on a piece of paper in 1877 that had generated, over 2 decades, a cascade of consequence ending in a dead man in an armchair and a detective in chains. The frost had made everything very bright and very clear, and the stars were out with an abundance that London's gaslit sky rarely permits. I thought about that too, about clarity and its conditions and the effort required to see things as they actually are rather than as they appear to be. Holmes makes this effort so continuously and naturally that it seems effortless, but I knew, from 20 years of watching him, that it is not. It is the defining work of his life, and it costs him something. The sustained effort of a mind wound always to its maximum, seeing always beyond the surface of things to the structure beneath. The habit of truth that will not, even when its application is professionally inconvenient, be abandoned. A man was almost destroyed because of it. A man was also ultimately vindicated because of it. These two facts exist together in a way that seems paradoxical, but is, on reflection, entirely consistent. The same quality of mind that made Holmes a threat worth eliminating also made the elimination impossible. You cannot neutralize a machine by placing an obstacle in its path if the machine's purpose is precisely the removal of obstacles. I reached my house at 11:15, let myself in, and sat for a while at my desk in the study before going to bed. On the desk was the notebook in which I record the rough notes of Holmes's cases before shaping them into whatever narrative form seems most appropriate to preserve them. I opened it to a fresh page and wrote the date, and below it, the accusation of Baker Street. A case of forgery, murder, and the remarkable durability of truth. Then I capped my pen, put it aside, and went to bed, satisfied, as I'm always satisfied in the end, by Holmes's cases, not simply because justice had been served, though it had, but because the truth had been found. Found patiently, found rigorously, found at some considerable personal cost and risk, found by a man who could have declined the risk and who would not have considered, for a single moment, declining it. Somewhere across London, in the rooms above Baker Street, the violin was probably still playing. I had no doubt of it. It almost always is, when Holmes is content, and Holmes is content in his particular and irreducible way, when the machinery of deduction has run its full and proper course and delivered the world, cleaned of one more deliberate obscurity, back into the light.